Another course goal is to discuss processes of social interaction under pandemics. Sociologists see humans as fundamentally social. From a young age, we're taught by the people around us how to use symbols like language to communicate. We're also taught values, beliefs, and norms. What is normal and abnormal? What is right and wrong? Under lockdown and self-isolation, or even quarantine, our social interactions are reduced, or at the very least, these interactions undergo a shift in medium. This has implications not just for our interactions, but for our identity. Our self-concept, meaning who we think we are, is formed through our interactions with others. The way other people treat us acts as a mirror for our beliefs about who we are. Because we're always having new interactions, our sense of self is dynamic. This social conception of self is rooted in the classic works of George Mead and Charles Cooley. We'll touch on this work briefly throughout the course. Topics we'll discuss in relation to social interaction include social infrastructure. How does it affect communities when we close social infrastructure, meaning places for intentional and unintentional social interaction? We'll also consider social ties. How do people maintain social ties under lockdown, and how has COVID impacted friendships, for example? How have people innovated in response to these barriers impeding face-to-face interaction? We see here a virtual dance club. People are also getting creative about how to engage in physical distancing face-to-face. Here we see two neighbors in northern Canada bringing together bagpipes and Bhangra dancing. For me, this beautiful video really draws attention to the differences between social distancing and physical distancing. We can also ask about another type of social connection, dating under COVID. Dr. Bonnie Henry has addressed this, which the public has found both informative and also entertaining. There have been lots of innovations in online dating, including online speed dating. We will ask how this is changing what it means to date and how people look for characteristics in one another. We'll also consider clothing and identity under lockdown. We know that pajama sales have more than doubled in the past few months. So much so that there is a pajama chic fashion trending. What does it mean to not have to conform to our usual daily routines? Not having as many opportunities to get dressed and to go out. How does this affect our sense of self and in how we interact with other people? We'll look at social networks analysis, particularly of physical distancing measures, considering outcomes at different levels of distancing. Another goal of this course is to explore how COVID-19 affected social institutions and how social institutions responded and adapted. But what is a social institution? A social institution is an organized set of beliefs, rules, and patterns focused on meeting basic social needs. For example, the need to pass on knowledge from one generation to the next is met by institutionalized education. The need to establish legitimate uses of power is met by the government as an institution. You may have implicitly learned a lot about the function of sport as a social institution under this pandemic. As access to spaces for recreation closed, what did we lose by not being able to play as many sports and not having as many sports to watch on TV? This unusual moment of not having access to sport reminds us of what sports offer to individuals and to communities. What functions do sports as a social institution offer us? Sports most definitely offer the fun and amusement of recreation, as well as the health benefits of getting and staying in shape. Most people would recognize these outcomes of sport. These are called manifest functions because they are the obvious and intended consequences of this social institution. But there are also less obvious or intentional outcomes of sport. Playing on a sports team helps build social relationships. Sports also create numerous jobs if you think about sports as an industry, and just the number of people that work in a stadium for the night when there's a sporting event, all the way down to maintenance and the people that sell beverages and tickets and so on. We also experience social connection through sport. Think about all of the interactions when you go to watch a game at an arena. The pleasure of getting swept up in the crowd in the moment of cheering and chanting and singing and doing the wave. Sports also pass on values. What are some values that we learn through watching or playing sports? Competition is a big one, particularly within capitalist societies where competition is valued under a meritocracy, as well as patriotism, pride in one's community or one's country. And sports can be an outlet for stress. Yelling at the TV screen or playing a sport can be a venting process at the end of the day. We've seen that as sports have been suspended and people who may not be working due to layoffs have extra time, there's a rise in social movement activity under lockdown, including the Black Lives Matter movement. Some might say that sports help maintain a population that is more easily governable and occupied with their time. What we've described here are latent functions, the less recognized and less intended consequences of a social pattern. These latent functions are still mostly positive and useful for society, even if they weren't intended. Sports are so important to social function that some alternatives have emerged under lockdown. Here we see an article from the New York Times that reads, "Competitive marble racing finds fans in a world missing sports." Here's an example of one of the races. And you'll notice they're even recreating the experience of being in the stands. But if you look more closely, what is it that's in the stands? It is actually more marbles. At the same time, there's some more negative functions of sport. The intense competition can lead to forms of cheating, and in some cases, athletes push themselves so hard that they can have some long-term health risks. These would be called dysfunctions, any social pattern that may disrupt the operation of society. Under COVID, additional elements of sport become dysfunctional, particularly the close contact, both in playing sports and in watching sports in a large stadium, as well as having people over to your home to watch sports on TV. In this course, we're going to look at a variety of social institutions and how they have responded to COVID. We will look at science as a social institution, how science developed historically at a particular point in time, how scientists have responded to the need for a vaccine and the need to share information across national borders, how scientific information has been disseminated among the public, and how the public values or not this information. We are going to look at the institution of work under COVID. How has working from home changed work itself? Which jobs are eligible to work from home and which ones are not? And what are the implications of a future world with more work from home potentially? This article argues that as more and more people work from home, this could have implications for cities and urban planning. One of the most obvious outcomes of COVID has been impacts on the education system at all levels of education. We will ask how shutting down schools and having students learn remotely can impact different groups of students differently. We'll also look at the impacts of COVID on healthcare, particularly thinking about frontline workers. And we'll consider healthcare systems in different national contexts and how they were set up to respond to this challenge. We'll look at the institution of the family and how this institution bore the brunt of lockdown outcomes, also the division of labor in the home and other challenges that can emerge under lockdown. We'll discuss COVID and the economy, particularly how different classes were able to respond and adapt to COVID, and the effects of various forms of government social safety nets.